Chapter 4, Part 1. Claudia and Jamie awoke very early the next morning. It was still dark. Their stomachs felt like tubes of toothpaste that had been all squeezed out, giant, economy-sized tubes. They had to be out of bed and out of sight before the museum staff came on duty. Neither was accustomed to getting up so early, to feeling so unwashed, or feeling so hungry. They dressed in silence. Each felt that peculiar chill that comes from getting up in the early morning, the chill that must come from one's own bloodstream, for it comes in summer as well as winter from some inside part of you that knows it is early morning. Claudia always dreaded that brief moment when her pajamas were shed and her underwear was not yet on. Even before she began undressing, she always had her underwear laid out in the bed in the right direction, right for getting into as quickly as possible. She did this now, too, but she hurried less, pulling her petticoat down over her head. She took good long whiffs of the wonderful essence of detergent and clean Dacron cotton which floated down with the petticoat. Next to any kind of elegance, Claudia loved good clean smells. After they were dressed, Claudia whispered to Jamie, "Let's stash our book bags and instrument cases before we man our stations." They agreed to scatter their belongings. Thus, if the museum officials found one thing, they wouldn't necessarily find all. While still at home, they had removed all identification on their cases as well as their clothing. Any child who has watched only 1 month of worth of television knows to do that much. Claudia hid his violin case in a sarcophagus that had no lid. It was well above eye level, and Jamie helped hoist her up so that she could reach it. It was a beautiful carved Roman marble sarcophagus. She hid her book bag behind a tapestry screen in the rooms of French furniture. Jamie wanted to hide his things in the mummy case, but Claudia said that would be unnecessarily complicated. The Egyptian wing of the Metropolitan was too far away from their bedroom for the number of risks involved. It might as well be in Egypt. So the trumpet case was hidden inside a huge urn and Jamie's book bag was neatly tucked behind a drap that was behind a statue from the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, the museum people had fastened all the drawers of their furniture so that they couldn't be opened. They had never given a thought to the convenience of Jemmy Kincat. Manning their stations meant climbing back into the booth and waiting during the perilous time. When the museum was open to the staff, but not to visitors, they washed up, combed their hair, and even brushed their teeth. Then began those long moments. That first morning they weren't quite sure when the staff would arrive, so they hid good and early. While Claudia stood couched down waiting, the emptiness and the hollowness of all the museum corridors filled her stomach. She was starved. She spent her time trying not to remember delicious things to eat. Jamie made one slight error that morning. It was almost enough to be caught. When he heard the sound of running water, he assumed that some male visitor was using the men's room to wash up. He checked his watch and saw that it was 10:05. He knew that the museum officially opened at 10 o'clock, so he stepped down to walk out of his booth. It was not, however, a museum visitor who had turned on the water tap. It was a janitor filling his bucket. He was leaning down in the act of wringing out his mop when he saw Jamie's legs appear from nowhere and then saw Jamie emerge. "When did you come from? Where did you come from?" he asked. Jamie smiled and nodded. "Mother always says that I came from heaven." He bowed politely and walked out, delighted with his brush with danger. He could hardly wait to tell Claudia. Claudia chose not to be amused on so empty a stomach. The museum restaurant wouldn't open until 11:30, and the snack bar wouldn't open until after that. So they left the museum to get breakfast. They went to the automat and used up $1 worth of Bruce nickels. Jamie allotted 10 nickels to Claudia and kept 10 for himself. Jamie bought a cheese sandwich and coffee. After eating these, he still felt hungry and told Claudia she could have 25 cents more for pie if she wished. Claudia, who had eaten cereal and drunk pineapple juice, scolded him about the need to eat properly, breakfast food for breakfast and lunch food for lunch. Jamie countered with complaints about Claudia's narrow-mindedness. They were better organized that second day. Knowing that they could not afford more than 2 meals a day, they stopped at a grocery and bought small packages of peanut butter crackers for the night. They hid them in various pockets in their clothing. They decided to join a school group for lunch at the snack bar. There were certainly enough to choose from. That way, their faces would always be just part of the crowd. Upon their return to the museum, Claudia informed Jamie that they should take advantage of the wonderful opportunity they had to learn and to study. No other children in all the world since the war began had had such an opportunity. So she set forth for herself and for her brother the task of learning everything about the museum, one thing at a time. Claudia probably didn't realize that the museum has over 365,000 works of art. Even if she had, she could not have been convinced that learning everything about everything was not possible. Her ambitions were as enormous and as multidirectional as the museum itself. Every day they would pick a different gallery about which they would learn everything. He could pick first. She would pick second, he third, and so on, just like the television schedule at home. Jamie considered learning something every day outrageous. It was not only outrageous, it was unnecessary. Claudia simply didn't know how to escape. He thought he would put a quick end to this part of their running away career. He chose the galleries of the Italian Renaissance. He didn't even know what the Renaissance was, except that it sounded important and there seemed to be an awful lot of it. He figured that Claudia would soon give up in despair. When she gave Jamie first pick, Claudia had been certain that he would choose arms and armor. She herself found this interesting. There was probably 2 days' worth of learning there. Perhaps she might even choose the same on the second day. Claudia was surprised at Jamie's choice, but she thought she knew why he chose the Italian Renaissance. She thought she knew because, along with tennis, ballet, and diving lessons at the Y, she had taken art appreciation lessons last year. Her art teachers had said that the Renaissance was a period of glorification of the human form. As best she could figure out, that meant bare bodies. Many painters of the Italian Renaissance had painted huge, billowy, bosomy, naked ladies. She was amazed at Jamie. She thought he was too young for that. He was. She never even considered the possibility that he wanted her to be bored. She had given her first choice, and she was stuck with it. So she marched with him toward the long, wide stairway straight in from the main entrance, which leads directly to the Hall of the Italian Renaissance. If you think of doing something in New York City, you can be certain that at least 2,000 other people have that same thought. And of the 2,000 who do, about 1,000 will be standing in line waiting to do it. That day was no exception. There were at least 1,000 people waiting in line to see things in the hall of the Italian Renaissance. Claudia and Jamie did not think that there was anything unusual about the size of the crowd. This was New York. Crowded was part of the definition of New York. Too many art experts, Luxembourg crowded is part of the definition of the Italian Renaissance too. It was a time much like this. Artistic activity was everywhere. Keeping track of the artists of the 15th and 16th centuries in Italy is as difficult as keeping track of the tax laws in the 1950s and 60s in the United States, and almost as complicated. As they reached the top of the stairs, a guard said, "Line forms to the right. Single file, please." They did as they were told, partly because they didn't want to offend any guard or even attract his attention, and partly because the crowd made them. Ladies' arms draped with pocketbooks and men's arms draped with coats formed a barrier as difficult to get through as barbed wire. Claudia and Jamie stood in the manner of all children who are standing in line. They stood leaning back with their necks stretched and their heads tilted away, way back, making a vain effort to see over the shoulders of the tall adult who always appears in front of them. Jamie could see nothing but the coat of the man in front of him. Claudia could see nothing but a piece of Jamie's head plus the coat of the man in front of Jamie. Okay, then we will have part 2 in next video.